Hello aqua friends, we are going to make a beautiful rose today, and I want to talk about the process I go through to plan a painting. So first we have an idea, we have to pick out our colors, plan our layers. If there's any practicing involved on techniques you've never done, you want to do that on a scrap piece of paper. And then finally we want to have a great drawing to follow before we even start painting. So planning things out in advance will get you a long way. So that is really our first step, is to plan. Our second step would be to do this underpainting that I am working on right now. I planned very jewel tone colors. I really wanted the bright yellows to shine through in the green stems of this rose. And so my underpainting for the stems and the leaves, I chose Indian yellow along with some leaf green. So really there's not much watercolor technique in laying down the color. You're just basically painting in wet on dry the shapes that you already drew. The very tips of the rose are a little bit pink. They have some pink undertones, and I am just using my magenta mixed with the green that I'm going to use. The contrasting colors gives me a muddy rose color that I'm using for the tips of those stems. I'm erasing my lines for the rose. I don't want them to be as prominent. And I am using Quin Magenta for the rose. And I'm keeping it very simple and basically just using the one color. It's sort of, from the reference photo, as you can see, a white rose that has the tips of the rose tainted pink, and it's a very pretty reference photo that I got from, it's either Eber or Unsplash, and it just really drew my attention, so I wanted to paint this for you guys. So my first layer is very light. You always want to paint from light to dark. Your underpainting should always be a very watery consistency of paint, because you want to build up your layers and you want to build up a three-dimensional look. So you don't want to go too dark too fast. So the rose petals obviously are going to take the longest because there's many rose petals, and basically I'm outlining the tops of where the pigment is most saturated and then using a watery mixture to blend it out. So my second layer of color on the stems and leaves is sap green. And notice my colors are nice and fresh. They're nice and bright. To get the shadowy area, I am mixing in some of my dusty rose with the sap green, as you can see, to get that shadowed area underneath the leaf. coming in with the same sap green mixture and doing the small leaves under the rose. So this painting took about 2 hours to do. While your rose is drying, you could go back down and work on the stem and the leaves. That's the nice thing about this painting, is you don't really have to walk away because your first layer will be dry by now. And you can start on your second layer for the leaves. I'm concentrating on getting that sap green on the leaf and getting it really nice and wet and covered. There's a tiny little leaf that I have to paint around. There's a shadow on the right hand side of that leaf. I'm using a bit of shadow green. Now while it's still wet, I'm taking a script liner brush that's damp and I'm drawing in those veins. I dip the script liner brush in the water first, and then I wipe it off on my piece of paper towel, and then I touch the wet paint with it to make very, very thin, lighter lines, as you can see. It's done very delicately. If you don't wipe off your brush first on the piece of paper towel, you will create a bigger bloom. So it just takes some practice. That could be part of your planning stage, is practicing that on a scrap piece of paper. You also have to wait for the sheen of the paper. That sheen that you see right now, that has to subside before you could use your script liner brush to make the veins of the leaf. Otherwise, it won't show up very well. So while it's drying, I'm adding in some darker colors on the tips of the leaf where it needs to be. Then when it's dry enough, I'm using my script liner, and notice, wipe off first, then you go to your painting. Back in the water, wipe off, painting. Back in the water, wipe off, painting. And I just repeat this process. So that's really important. If you don't wipe off that brush first, it'll be too much water and it'll create a big blotchy bloom. Okay, and you see those lines are very delicate. And that adds to the realism of your leaf. Doing the third layer on these tiny leaves underneath the rose. This is our third step, building up layers and creating texture. We're building up the layers by adding more paint and creating texture by using your script liner brush to create those veins like we just did, and also lifting. I use a very thin flat brush to lift out the main veins in these little leaves. There's my brush that I'm lifting. Okay, I'm just using a flat brush and it really does a great job. Now I'm making some tonal adjustments. This would be the fourth step that we're doing on the stem and the leaves, is making tonal adjustments. And I noticed that the stem needed to be a little bit more darker to kind of match the leaves. And I needed to get that shadow even darker underneath the rose. And so I'm using some shadow green while it's still wet to put in those darkest darks. Adding in that tiny little leaf. And I'll pretty much be done painting the stem and the leaves at this point. And then I am going to do this same process with the rose. So we already have our underpainting on the rose. We're going to be building up our layers of color and texture. This is step 3 on the rose. So I wet that area because I want it to bleed and have soft edges, but drawing in that color along the edge that's dry on the other side of that petal, it's going to produce a very dramatic outline, just like in the reference photo. And so basically I'm going to do the same thing with all of the petals. While one area is drying, I'm going to work on the next area and keep going in the same manner. The middle of the rose is darker on the top, and it pretty much used a straight coat of the magenta without having any paper white areas. And then just building up the petals from there. So that area is flooded with moisture, and I'm going right along the edges to create that really nice saturated outline. There's Fig. He was helping me paint. Actually, he was very interested in my water bucket, and of course he can't drink that water, so yeah, it's like having a teenager. That area is wet, coming in with that outline, and it softly bleeds into the wet. So it's really starting to look like a rose now. I know it's a very tedious process painting like this, but if you are a realistic painter like I am, it's enjoyable to see it all come together. Okay, the middle of the rose is a lot darker, so I'm putting a layer of magenta on there. Working on a little bit of texture with some very fine lines while that middle area dries. Alright, so after I came back to that area after it dried to work on those inner petals, and get those dark areas in there, the tips. Here's Fig. He just loves watching me paint. So in this fourth step for the rose, I am looking at the rose and seeing if I need to make any tonal adjustments. If there needs to be some more dark areas in there, a few more petals, a few more areas. So I always ask myself this question: are your darks as dark as they need to be? And do you have any highlights that you need to pull up? And that is the last step in the painting process. Once you have your tonal values as dark as they need to be, there might be some final detail work that you would like to do. And then your painting will be done. So I'm making those little detailed changes right now. Sign your painting and you are done. I hope you enjoyed today's tutorial. Let me know if you would like to see me do more botanicals. I love tulips, and I actually found some really great reference photos for those. So I will see you guys next week.